Okay, so let's set the scene. You've got a 26-year-old who says he can read minds. Then you have a rationalist who spent his entire life fighting superstition. And then you have a public challenge that has absolutely gripped the nation. We're going to dive right into the viral and, yet pretty complex story of Bageshwar Baba. Yeah, that's a direct quote from the man himself. This was actually caught on camera when a follower tried to touch his feet. And, a statement like that, it just immediately throws this whole thing into a really sharp and pretty uncomfortable light. So that's really the big question we're trying to unpack here, right? Is this a genuine spiritual leader? Or is there something else going on entirely? What happens when these incredible claims of divine power suddenly have to face public scrutiny? Let's get into it. All right, first things first, we really need to get a handle on the man who calls himself Bageshwar Baba, a guy who has millions of people hanging on his every word. So his real name is Dhirendra Krishna Garg. And get this, he's only 26 years old. He runs this ashram, Bageshwar Dham, and he's gotten super famous for these events he calls Divya Darbars, divine courts. And this is where he seems to just, pull people's deepest, most personal secrets right out of thin air. But, way before anyone was challenging his so-called miracles, he was already making headlines for completely different and, frankly, much more alarming reasons. His speeches have been really openly communal. We're talking about calling for followers to arm themselves and even telling them to raise the homes of stone pelters. And he's admitted he's just going to keep on making speeches like this. So, as always, for every action, there's a reaction, right? And in this story, that reaction came from a man who has pretty much dedicated his entire life to challenging claims exactly like the ones Bageshwar Baba is making. This is Sham Manav. And what's really fascinating here is that he's not some anti-religion crusader. He actually calls himself a Sanatani Hindu, following in the tradition of people like Gandhi and Swami Vivekananda. For him, this fight isn't about faith. It's about fraud that's committed in the name of faith. And look, the stakes here are incredibly high. The organization he's a part of was founded by a man named Dhirendra who was tragically murdered for doing this kind of work. I mean, Dabolkar's activism is what led directly to a major anti-superstition law in Maharashtra. So for these guys, this is not just some intellectual debate. It's a dangerous, deadly serious mission. So, with that law behind him and his organization's mission in mind, Sham Manav threw down a very specific, very testable challenge. We're not talking about vague spiritual questions here. Nope. It was 2 concrete tests of the Baba's supposed powers. Oh, and there was a 3 million rupee reward on the table if he could pull it off. Okay, so this brings us to the main event, the big standoff in Nagpur. Bageshwar Baba was holding this huge event in Maharashtra, which happens to be Sham Manav's home turf. And, crucially, it's a place where that anti-superstition law is in full effect. And this is the key moment. The event was advertised to run until January 13th. The poster said so. But on January 11th, Dhirendra Shastri just packed up and left, 2 days early. Unsurprisingly, Sham Manav's side called it what it looked like. They said he fled the challenge. What followed was basically a war of words. The Baba's camp said, oh no, the event was only ever planned for 7 days. And then they invited Manav to come to their territory in Raipur. But Manav wasn't having it. He said, nope, the challenge has to be in Nagpur on neutral ground and under the protection of Maharashtra's anti-fraud laws. And it wasn't just the rationalists who were skeptical. One of the most respected leaders in Hinduism, Shankaracharya Swami Abhimuktasharanand, he weighed in too. And his point was so powerful. He basically said, hey, if you can perform miracles, why not go to Joshimath and stop the land from sinking? Why not use your powers to solve real problems? Now that would be a miracle. Okay, let's take a step back for a second. Because while this whole story is about Bageshwar Baba, the phenomenon itself, well, it's absolutely universal. This is not just about one guy or one particular religion. I mean, you see this pattern everywhere. You have so-called fake babas in Hinduism who've been involved in horrible crimes. You have practitioners of black magic in Islam accused of exploiting their followers. You have Christian pastors claiming they can perform miracle cures while blackmailing people. It's a sad truth, but this pattern of using faith to take advantage of vulnerable people, it crosses all religious lines. $1 million. That's a lot of money, right? Well, for decades, this was the prize money for a very famous, long-standing challenge. It was offered by the legendary magician James Randi. $1 million to anyone who could prove, under proper scientific conditions, that they had any kind of supernatural power. And you know what? In decades, not a single person ever claimed that prize. And that's the real difference, isn't it? Randi was a magician. He did incredible tricks to entertain people, but he always said, hey, these are just tricks. He wasn't pretending it was some divine gift to con people and build a following. Which brings us to probably the most important question in all of this. If a lot of this stuff is just clever tricks, why do so many people, and I'm talking highly educated people too, believe in it so fiercely? Well, it's a mix of things, really. You could point to an education system that often values memorizing facts over thinking critically. And then there's the very nature of blind faith, right? It's designed to discourage questioning. But I think the biggest piece of the puzzle is just raw human vulnerability. When people are desperate, when they're in pain, they will look for a solution. Any solution. And you have to look at the cultural context here too. In many Western countries, if you're struggling, you might go see a therapist. But in India, where professional mental health care can be hard to access or carries a stigma, these charismatic figures, they essentially step into that role. They become the therapists, the counselors, the problem solvers for millions of people who feel like they just have nowhere else to go. So after all that, where does this leave us? The point here isn't to bash anyone's faith, not at all. It's about trying to figure out where the line is between genuine spiritual guidance and, well, cynical exploitation. If you look back historically, the whole idea of a Baba or a spiritual guide was about selfless service. I mean, think about figures like Swami Vivekananda or Guru Nanak. They were like life coaches, personal counselors. They offered wisdom freely. It wasn't a business. They weren't putting on a show. They were teachers. And maybe that's the real heart of the matter. This entire controversy, it all just boils down to the simple power of asking a question when faced with an extraordinary claim. So if there's one thing to take away from all this, it's that in a world that's just flooded with people offering easy answers and miracle cures, maybe the most valuable thing you can have is just the courage to ask why.